The Oceania Majesty was the epitome of luxury, a gleaming cruise liner that promised unforgettable experiences to its guests. The ship boasted everything from gourmet dining to private excursions, and its staff was known for their polished professionalism, or so it seemed. On this bright, breezy morning, guests gathered on the upper deck for a guided tour of the ship's exclusive amenities. Among them were Elijah and Camille Johnson, a charismatic black couple in their early 40s, along with their teenage son Jordan. The family was casually dressed but carried themselves with a quiet elegance that hinted at their success. The tour guide, a middle-aged woman named Karen Simmons, stood at the front of the group, clipboard in hand. Her bright smile seemed practiced, though her eyes occasionally betrayed a flicker of judgment as she scanned the crowd. "Good morning, everyone," Karen began, her tone cheerful. "Welcome aboard the Oceania Majesty. I'll be showing you all the wonderful features of our ship today, so let's get started." The group murmured in excitement as Karen led them toward the first stop, a luxurious spa and wellness center. As she described the state-of-the-art facilities, she seemed to make a point of addressing the other guests, while ignoring the Johnson family entirely. Elijah noticed but said nothing, exchanging a knowing glance with Camille. They had encountered this type of behavior before and weren't about to let it ruin their trip. As the tour continued, Karen's subtle disdain for the Johnsons became harder to ignore. She spoke to them curtly when they asked questions and often cut them off mid-sentence. Finally, during a visit to the ship's VIP dining room, Karen's attitude escalated. Jordan, curious about the restaurant's offerings, raised his hand. "Excuse me, do they serve Caribbean dishes here?" Karen sighed audibly, her cheerful facade slipping. "I doubt they'd have anything too exotic," she said, her tone laced with condescension. "This is a luxury cruise after all." The group fell silent, and a few of the other guests exchanged uneasy glances. Camille's jaw tightened, but Elijah placed a hand on her arm, silently asking her to stay calm. "Is there a problem with my son's question?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but firm. Karen gave a thin smile. "Not at all. I just think it's important to remember that this ship caters to a certain type of clientele." The unspoken implication hung heavily in the air, and Camille's patience finally wore thin. "And what type of clientele would that be exactly?" she asked, her tone icy. Karen's face flushed, but she quickly masked her discomfort. "I'm just saying that our guests typically prefer more refined options." Elijah looked at her evenly. "I see. Please continue the tour." Karen hesitated but quickly moved on, clearly flustered. What she didn't know was that her behavior had not gone unnoticed, and that the Johnsons were far more than just another group of tourists. The tour continued to wind through the opulent halls of the Oceania Majesty, with Karen regaining her composure and slipping back into her rehearsed cheerfulness. She led the group to the private pool deck reserved for VIP guests, gesturing toward the shimmering infinity pool that overlooked the open sea. "This is one of the ship's crown jewels," Karen said, her tone sugary. "Only our most exclusive guests have access to this area. It's a space designed for ultimate relaxation and luxury." Camille exchanged a glance with Elijah, her irritation still simmering beneath her composed exterior. Jordan, meanwhile, looked up at his parents, his expression curious but subdued. As the group admired the deck, Karen sidled up to one of the other guests, a middle-aged woman with a designer bag. "It's always interesting to see who ends up on these tours," Karen murmured quietly, though not quietly enough. "Some people just don't seem to fit in, if you know what I mean." The woman looked startled and didn't respond, her gaze darting toward the Johnsons. Elijah heard the comment but said nothing, his expression unreadable. Instead, he turned to Camille and said softly, "It's almost time." Camille nodded. "I think so." Karen clapped her hands to get the group's attention. "Let's move along, everyone. Next, we'll visit the executive lounge, a space most of you will never get to see again unless you're part of our top-tier membership." The Johnsons followed silently, their calm composure a stark contrast to Karen's increasingly transparent disdain. As the group entered the lounge, Elijah's phone buzzed, He glanced at the screen and gave a small nod to Camille. "Excuse me for a moment," Elijah said, stepping aside to take the call. Karen watched him go, her irritation evident. "Please, sir, we need to stay together as a group," she said sharply. Elijah paused, turning to face her. "I won't be long. You can continue without me." Karen huffed but resumed her spiel, gesturing to the lavish furnishings and expansive views. "This lounge is reserved for the highest-paying members of our cruise family," she explained. "It's a place where they can enjoy privacy and first-class service." As she spoke, the lounge doors opened, and a sharply dressed man entered. He carried an air of authority, and several staff members immediately turned their attention to him. "Mr. Johnson," the man said, addressing Elijah with a respectful nod. "Welcome aboard, sir." Karen froze mid-sentence, her face paling. "Wait, Mr. Johnson?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah stepped forward, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Yes, Mr. Johnson, as in one of the owners of this cruise line." The group gasped, and all eyes turned to Karen, whose expression shifted from shock to horror. Karen stood frozen, her clipboard trembling in her hands. The color drained from her face as Elijah's words sank in. "Oh, one of the owners?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," Elijah replied calmly, his gaze unwavering. "My wife and I, along with a few partners, own this cruise line. We've spent years building a company that values luxury, diversity, and, most importantly, respect for every guest." The group of tourists, now murmuring amongst themselves, looked at Karen with expressions ranging from shock to quiet disapproval. Camille stepped forward, her tone calm but firm. "Throughout this tour, you've gone out of your way to make us feel unwelcome," Camille said, her voice carrying across the room. "You assumed we didn't belong here and treated us as less than everyone else, and now you're realizing just how wrong you were." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked around as if searching for an escape, but the weight of the moment held her in place. Elijah turned to the sharply dressed man who had addressed him earlier. "Mr. Reynolds, can you ensure this situation is documented and reported to HR? I think some retraining is in order." "Of course, sir," Reynolds replied, his tone professional. "I'll handle it immediately." Karen's face turned crimson. "Please, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. It was a misunderstanding." Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Misunderstanding?" he repeated. "Let's call it what it is. You made assumptions about us because of how we look. That's not just a misunderstanding. That's prejudice." Karen's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't know." "Exactly," Camille interjected. "You didn't know, and instead of treating us like everyone else, you chose to act on your ignorance. An apology is a start, but actions have consequences." Elijah nodded. "We're not here to humiliate you, Karen, but this is a luxury cruise line, and we hold our employees to the highest standards. That means treating every guest with respect, no exceptions." As the tour group quietly watched, Elijah addressed the group. "Thank you all for joining us today. We hope this experience hasn't diminished your enjoyment of the cruise. My family and I are committed to ensuring that every guest feels valued and welcome." The guests nodded, a few offering words of support. One woman spoke up, saying, "Thank you for addressing this so directly. It's refreshing to see accountability." Karen, now visibly shaken, looked at Elijah and Camille one last time. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." "That's up to you," Elijah said. "Change starts with recognizing your own biases and choosing to do better." With that, Elijah signaled to Reynolds, who escorted Karen out of the lounge for a formal review of her behavior. The room fell quiet as the Johnsons turned to the remaining guests, their poise unshaken despite the ordeal. After Karen was escorted from the room, the remaining guests turned their attention to Elijah and Camille, their expressions a mix of admiration and curiosity. The couple stood confidently, embodying the grace that had carried them through the uncomfortable experience. Elijah addressed the group, his tone warm but authoritative. "I'd like to thank you all for your patience. This isn't the kind of experience we want for anyone aboard our cruises, and I can assure you, we're taking steps to ensure it doesn't happen again." A man near the back of the group raised his hand. "Mr. Johnson, I just want to say that the way you handled this was incredible. Most people wouldn't have kept their composure like that." Elijah smiled. "Thank you. My wife and I believe that leading by example is the best way to inspire change." Camille stepped forward, her voice steady. "This cruise line was built on the idea that luxury is for everyone. No matter where you come from, no matter who you are, you deserve to feel welcome and valued here. That's a principle we will never compromise on." The group nodded, murmuring in agreement. A woman in the front row spoke up. "It's inspiring to see owners who are so hands-on and passionate about their company. I've been on a lot of cruises, but I've never seen leadership like this." Elijah and Camille exchanged a glance, their shared pride evident. "That means a lot to us," Camille said. "We're committed to creating an inclusive environment where everyone feels at home." As the tour resumed, led by Mr. Reynolds in Karen's absence, the atmosphere shifted. The guests seemed more engaged, asking thoughtful questions and complimenting the ship's design. Elijah and Camille occasionally chimed in, sharing anecdotes about the ship's creation and their vision for the company. Jordan, who had been quiet during much of the earlier tension, found himself surrounded by other teens from the group. "Your parents are amazing," one of them said. "It's so cool that they own this ship." Jordan grinned. "Yeah, they're pretty awesome. They've taught me a lot about standing up for what's right." By the end of the tour, the Johnson family had transformed what began as an uncomfortable experience into a moment of connection and understanding. Guests approached them individually, expressing their gratitude and admiration for how they had handled the situation. Meanwhile, Karen sat in an office with HR representatives, her clipboard resting forgotten on the desk. She replayed the events of the day in her mind, the shame and regret weighing heavily on her. For the first time, she truly reflected on her biases and how they had shaped her behavior. "I let my assumptions get in the way of my professionalism," Karen admitted, her voice shaky. "I want to do better." The HR representative nodded. "Acknowledging that is a step in the right direction. But actions speak louder than words. You'll undergo diversity and sensitivity training immediately, and your continued employment will depend on your ability to demonstrate change." Karen nodded, her determination to improve taking root. The following day, the Oceania Majesty continued its voyage under sunny skies, the tension from the previous incident now replaced with a renewed sense of unity among the passengers and crew. Word of what had happened spread quickly, and many guests expressed their appreciation for the Johnsons' leadership. Elijah and Camille sat on the upper deck with Jordan, enjoying the ocean breeze. They reflected on the previous day, knowing it was a moment that would resonate far beyond their family. "Do you think she'll change?" Jordan asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Elijah looked thoughtful. "I hope so," he said. "People are capable of change if they're willing to put in the effort. What matters is whether she learns from this experience." Camille nodded, placing a hand on Jordan's shoulder. "And even if she doesn't, we've done our part to stand up for what's right. That's what matters." Later that afternoon, as the Johnsons relaxed in the executive lounge, Karen entered, accompanied by Mr. Reynolds. She looked nervous but determined, holding a piece of paper in her hands. "Excuse me, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," Karen said, her voice quieter than usual. "May I speak with you?" The Johnsons exchanged a glance before Elijah nodded. "Of course. Please sit." Karen hesitated but eventually sat across from them. She placed the paper on the table. It was a handwritten letter. "I wanted to apologize again for how I treated you yesterday," she began. "I've spent the last 24 hours reflecting on my behavior, and I realize now how wrong I was. This letter is my apology in writing, but I wanted to say it to you in person as well." Camille picked up the letter, scanning it briefly. It was sincere and detailed, acknowledging Karen's biases and committing to change. "I've started the diversity training Mr. Reynolds assigned to me," Karen continued, "and I'm determined to do better, not just as an employee, but as a person." Elijah nodded, his expression serious but not unkind. "Thank you for taking responsibility, Karen. Growth isn't easy, but it's necessary." Karen's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you for giving me the chance to make things right. I won't let you down." By the end of the voyage, the atmosphere aboard the Oceania Majesty had transformed. Karen returned to her role as a tour guide with a new perspective, treating every guest with the respect they deserved. The incident became a turning point, prompting the cruise line to strengthen its training programs and reinforce its values of inclusion and equality. As for the Johnson family, they continued their journey as leaders who didn't just talk about change, but inspired it through action. Their experience on the ship became a testament to the power of standing up against prejudice and leading with grace. Back on shore, as they disembarked, Jordan turned to his parents with a smile. "You know, this cruise ended up being more memorable than I expected." Camille laughed. "That's one way to put it." Elijah placed an arm around his son. "Memorable for the right reasons, though, and that's what counts."